It's ugly outside, it's beautiful in here, and I am so excited for this next panel. Come on up, don't be shy. I don't think this crew needs much introduction, so I'm going to make this brief so we can get right to them, and I'll even start talking while they're walking. So, Mollie Hemingway, senior editor and founding member of the Federalist. Come on around here, guys, no problem. And one of the most insightful Fox News contributors you'll see. Mollie was born in Denver, actually. Went to CU Denver, right? Yeah. CU Denver. And if you ever met Mollie in person, she's very soft-spoken. You don't get that if you only know her from television. But her soft-spokenness belies a take-no-prisoners attitude, which I particularly loved in your takedown of Dana Milbank. That was really great. Mark Hemingway, yes, Mark and Mollie are married, senior writer at Real Clear Investigations, book editor at the Federalist, former senior writer at the Weekly Standard, which I miss because it reminds me of when Bill Kristol was mostly sane. And I want to commend actually one of Mark's recent pieces at Real Clear Politics about how in some circles it's okay to destroy a statue, but it's not okay to move a mailbox as part of a decades-old plan. And Mark's awesome Twitter handle is Heminator. So that's Victor Davis Hanson will be joining us by Zoom. There he is. He's an intellectual's intellectual, and yet he is still able to make truly important ideas understandable to the rest of us in his many brilliant columns and books and television appearances and appearances like this today. Professor Hanson is a military historian and farmer. He's a senior fellow in classics and military history at the Stanford University's Hoover Institution. One of his books, The End of Sparta, is a novel based on battle between Thebes and Sparta in 371 BC. So when we talk about incredible historical perspective on the topic of this panel, you've got it right there. And today's very lucky panel moderator, Amber Athey. You met her last night at dinner, right? A Washington editor for Spectator USA, hosts the Unfit to Print podcast. She was last year's Tony Blankley Fellow, as you all know, right here at the Steamboat Institute. She's covered the White House for the Daily Caller. She's covered universities and bias and that kind of thing for Campus Reform. And I'm going to go out on a limb. You tell me if I'm wrong here, but when you sing the national anthem, when you get to that "Oh, say does that Star-Spangled Banner part in the middle," do you yell the "O" extra loud?
Every single time.
Yeah, okay, me too. And maybe you can explain that to those people who didn't grow up in Maryland. And take it away, everybody. Enjoy this fantastic panel.
Well, now I feel obligated to tell you all that is a Baltimore Orioles fan tradition, is shouting the O during the national anthem. And you'll actually hear it at Caps games, too, because there's a lot of course, native Marylanders who go to the Caps games. Yeah, go Caps. So I think we're really at a perfect time for this panel, which is about the transition of power, rule of law, because we're about 2 months away from the election now, and we're already seeing attempts by the left to undermine the results of the election were Trump to win again. Just at the DNC this past week, Hillary Clinton was accusing Trump of trying to steal the election, of trying to cheat his way into victory. And then she told Joe Biden that if the race were close, that he should refuse to concede. But what's crazy to me is this is all happening all over again, but we still haven't fully grappled with what happened in 2016, which was this attempt by the intelligence agencies and really the deep state to turn Trump's victory into this Russian conspiracy theory. And when we look at where we currently are, we have AG Barr assigning John Durham to look into the origins of Crossfire Hurricane and potential wrongdoing. And Mollie, I was hoping you could give us an update on what Durham's uncovered so far and what else we can expect further down the line.
Great, thank you, Amber. Yeah, I've been covering the Russia collusion story for several years, and I'm always impressed when I'm speaking to people who aren't professionally covering it for years, how much they seem to know about it, because it's a very complicated story with all these twists and turns. The Durham investigation, quite unfortunately, compared to, say, the Mueller probe, involves no leaking. And as reporters, we find that very frustrating. There's just no leaking at all. So it's very hard to know exactly what's going on. What we do know is that they recently had a plea agreement with Kevin Kleinsmith, who's a former Mueller prosecutor, who did admit to manipulating evidence in order to secure a spy warrant on Carter Page. And I think a lot of people who've been following this story, they want really big people to go down. You know, they want Hillary Clinton in handcuffs or something like that. But this actually, and I think that makes them think this isn't a big deal. I actually think that was a huge deal that an FBI lawyer who worked for the Mueller probe admitted that he falsified this evidence in order to secure a spy warrant on a Trump campaign affiliate. It shows definitively, unlike the Russia collusion hoax, that there really was wrongdoing, as the Inspector General report that came out in December showed, you know, and it was a very, Inspector Generals tend to write fairly blandly, and that was actually a devastating report showing 17 major omissions and errors that FBI agents and DOJ officials perpetrated against Carter Page in order to spy on him. And after a year of spying on Carter Page, who had no legal representation, there were no charges against him. It was completely ridiculous spying on this man. But there was something that Attorney General Barr said right before that Kevin Kleinsmith deal was announced. He was on Hannity, I think, and he said, not a big deal tomorrow, but just shows that progress is being made. And I actually do think it's a pretty big deal. So when he says not a big deal, like not a major thing, but it shows progress, I think he wouldn't say that if that was all that there was. And I just want to say one other thing in terms of people having the appropriate level of expectation. Quite unfortunately, our law enforcement and intelligence agencies it's just like our country. It relies on virtuous people. Virtuous people should not be engaged in shenanigans. But when some of these people are engaged in shenanigans, sometimes there's not that much that can be done about it. If you read the Inspector General report on the Hillary Clinton probe, it showed that while the way that the FBI handled that probe was pretty much 180 degrees the opposite of the way they handled the Trump campaign probe, both ranges are allowed because there aren't that many strict rules guiding how they do these things. It makes it very difficult to hold people accountable when people aren't actually breaking any law. And Attorney General Barr had said, we're not going to go after people in the same way that previous politicized investigations have, where you try to ring them up on or set them in perjury traps or try to ring them up on process crimes. They want to show actual wrongdoing. So they're holding themselves to an incredibly high standard. And having said that, there is so much opportunity to expose wrongdoing. So I think people should expect two things coming out of this. One, I do think you'll get a definitive report just explaining how this all happened and what went wrong. And I would not be surprised if there are more indictments.
And looking at the Mueller report, Mark, can you sort of explain to people why that didn't include the allegations of wrongdoing or how the probe got started? Because really what we saw was the scope was set to be really wide, but then people were left wondering why so much of this information that Durham's now looking into was not included.
Well, I mean, I think Occam's razor sort of, applies to this. I mean, it was fairly obvious from the beginning what was going on with the Mueller probe. I mean, I don't want to paint with, too broad a brush here, but very clearly part of the problem with the Russia Gate probe was that from the beginning, there were people working at the highest levels of law enforcement agencies that were like trying to engineer exactly some kind of probe that would give them, sweeping powers to investigate. Because if you look at what happened with the Russiagate probe, basically, like at every turn, people are convinced, well, if I just get one more warrant, then we're going to finally, get to the truth, because we all know Donald Trump's in bed with Russia, and like they just were in this massive like feedback loop of delusion, basically. And then by the time that actually exploded into the Mueller report, it was basically a conclusion in search of a justification. I mean, if you actually read the Mueller report carefully, basically they were trying to desperately to make a case for obstruction that Congress could take up, but they were making a case for obstruction, for investigating charges that didn't exist foundationally that they had to admit within the report. So it was a very hard political sell. You're going to tell people that, the President of the United States should be rung up essentially on obstruction charges for crimes that didn't happen that you were investigating. It's been one thing after another where, at every turn they've been trying to justify their extraordinarily inappropriate conduct as intelligence agencies, and we're still there. I mean, we're still in this, delusion. And at some point, people have got to, snap out of that. I mean, as my wife pointed out rather astutely, there are limits within our framework to how much accountability that you can impose without basically tearing down the entire edifice of the FBI. And one way to actually impose some accountability is politically, and that's on us. So, if you want accountability on a broader scale for this stuff, if you want to know why the Mueller report happened, why they did, and things like that, our best hope, I guess, is to get Trump reelected, and maybe put a fire under our Republican elected representatives to actually do the work of getting to the bottom of this, which thus far most Republicans have been fairly reluctant to do.
Yeah, I think it's important how you both talk about tempering expectations, because if people go into this thinking, well, we're going to indict James Comey and he's going to go to jail, people are going to be very disappointed. But there is good work
I still
happening.
dream of that one.
Well, who doesn't? Yeah, no, that's the ultimate dream. But, moving even beyond just criminal charges and legal investigations, you brought up political pressure. Victor, I'm wondering if you can speak to other potential avenues of reform for our intelligence agencies. Is it a matter of, for example, reforming the FISA process? What else can we do to make sure that this does not happen again?
Well, I think we really have to look at the issue of security clearance for retired intelligence and military officer high officials, because they seem to leverage that ability to have inside contacts, whether they're serving on the board of the military or intelligence and General Dynamics or Lockheed, or they're paid consultants on cable TV. And they kind of wink and nod and say that my sources tell me. Remember, James Clapper weaponized that ability and assured everybody that Mueller was going to indict people. It's completely fabricated. That's one thing that we could do. I think that we really have to have some moratorium on CIA, FBI officials going into the private sector immediately after they leave office. But if I could just touch on one thing really quickly that I'm even more worried about than Mueller and the DOJ and the weaponization of the FBI and even the CIA, and that is the retired military officers. They're all subject in theory to the Code of Military Justice, which says even after retirement, they cannot disparage the commander-in-chief. It's sort of like the Logan Act, we don't enforce it. But we've never, in our past, we've had, General McClellan in the Civil War, Edmund Walker was critical of Kennedy, Curtis LeMay was. Everybody remembers Douglas MacArthur and Truman. But in all of those cases, it was all considered wrong what the military officers did, both in service and on retirement. This is extraordinary. We've had decorated officers. They're all four-star generals or admirals. And they've almost hinted like a coup. Admiral McRaven said that Trump should leave sooner than later. And General McCaffrey said that he was a Mussolini-like character. And General Hayden tweeted out pictures of Auschwitz when Trump continued the Obama policy of temporarily separating parents from their children when they were undergoing legal hearings at the border. General Mattis also used that image of Hitler when he said that he was using Nazi-like strategies to divide us. Now that is all, that's all in theory rhetoric, but what was even scarier is two very highly decorated lieutenant colonels that were prominent in the Iraq War, Lieutenant Colonel Yushlin, but especially John Nagel, recently wrote a letter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs saying that they had to take an active participation in monitoring the election and might have to remove Donald Trump. And then we remember General Mollie, who said that he's not going to be a photo op and he's not going to get involved with the president when he was going to use federal troops. And then four former chairmen of the Joint Chief, I think it was Dempsey, Mullen, Myers, and Colin Powell, then seconded that. And remember, that was very strange because during the Rodney King riots, it was Colin Powell who left a message for George H.W. Bush saying, whenever you want to use federal troops, just call, I'm ready. So it wasn't a position of principle. And remember, when they did that, Joe Biden said, I've got these guys covering my back and they can come into the White House and remove the president. that seems crazy, but a very prominent lawyer who was active in the DOJ, married to a very highly decorated military officer, Rosa Brooks, 11 days after the president was elected, wrote a very stunning article in Foreign Policy magazine. And here's what she said. We've got to, how do we move Trump sooner and later? And she gave you three avenues to do it. The first was impeachment, which she sort of said, you know, you don't really have to have high crimes and misdemeanors or treason and briberies as specified in the Constitution. But the problem with that, it takes too long. Or we could invoke the 25th Amendment that he used non compos mentis. And of course, that was very prescient because that served as almost a guide for what would subsequently follow. But the scariest was the third, and that is we could have a military coup. It's not my words, it's hers. And she outlined scenarios in which military officers, patriotic to the Constitution, as she said, would not follow presidential order, but would caucus together and then remove him from office. So what I'm getting at is when you have people of that stature and reputation, they're normalizing something that's treasonous and dangerous to the Constitution. And that had always been the fantasies, you know, the sort of the 7 days in May accusations of the left. They were always critical of the military industrial complex. But the fact of the matter is that the military industrial complex is now very sympathetic to the left, and they've adopted it as a method to short circuit constitutional processes. And I think it's very dangerous. And all those former generals should have apologized. Somebody said to me recently, well, there was only about 30 of them, but the problem was they were the 30 most influential. And even though they were in retirement, a lot of their colleagues were not in retirement, and they served on military defense contractors. They're on the boards of big corporations like General Dynamics that are having contracts. And the final thing I'll say is that the right has been very sympathetic to the military in warding off defense from the left. But I would urge my conservative friends to say, you know what, that should end. And from now on, we should have a moratorium on retiring generals serving on defense boards that have business with the Pentagon, maybe not issuing them so liberally security clearances, and then forcing the code of military justice, because what we're creating is something akin to the weaponization of the media, the foundations, the university, and now it's the high echelons of the military. And it's very scary. And at least the left, in the sense that Joe Biden, how he interprets that, it's on record how he interpreted it. And when you have people like Eric Kleinsmith that Mollie referenced earlier in bad French grammar saying "Vive la résistance," you can see that, and the coup continues, and the coup that was Mark Zaid said that, a lawyer to Mr. Vindman. So it's normalizing something that's quite dangerous. And Donald Trump was a test case. He was the first person without military or political experience. He was very controversial, and he said to the country, will your institutions withstand something that you're not familiar with? And so far the answer is maybe.
Yeah, no, I think that's all really great background, and it kind of speaks to the fact as well that the reason a lot of this was directed at Trump was because he was an outsider who threatened the power that so many of these people enjoyed in the DC system. And when it comes to the military generals, for example, they didn't like the fact that Trump wanted to pull troops from Afghanistan and Syria, and a lot of it is really about the larger power structure of the US government. I want to go back to something you said, Mark, which was the consequences of the election coming up. If Joe Biden wins, what does this mean for the Durham investigation, or even just more broadly, the introspection that we have on these institutions? Does everything just snap back to normal? Are we right back to where we were in 2014, 2015?
Well, that's a good question. A big part of the problem here is the media. I mean, I don't know what to say. I mean, people have been saying the media are gaslighting us over the Russia investigation, but that implies like some level of intention behind what they're doing, and it's not even that. I mean, they're living in some kind of alternate reality. So the Washington Post has been keeping the track of this running tally. It's like Donald Trump, I think they're up to 20,000. Donald Trump has told 20,000 false or misleading statements. And look, we all know Donald Trump has an unusual relationship with the facts sometimes, obviously. But if you actually like look at what they're doing there with that, it's like they're living in an alternate universe. One of their most repeated lies on their 20,000 lies that Donald Trump has told, they just dinged him for this at the convention. Out of the 20,000 misleading statements or lies that Donald Trump has uttered, 227 of them are some version of Trump saying, "I was spied on by the Obama administration." Like, that's considered one of Donald Trump's most repeated lies, according to the Washington Post.
True.
And it is completely and utterly true. So, like the Kleinsmith pleading guilty a week or so ago, this is probably the most significant legal development in this entire, meandering, mess that's been going on for 4 years. And how did the media cover it? There's a internet personality named Iowa Hawk who likes to say the media likes to cover important stories with a pillow until they stop moving. And that's basically what has been happening with all of this, Russian news. They find angles where they can to spin things like the IG report, or oftentimes, and then this is increasingly the case, where major stories happen and they just ignore them largely. Maybe they file like, a very short, succinct story and bury it on their website. But, comparatively minor developments against Trump just get trumpeted beyond belief. So, I guess the other part of the accountability factor, going on behind the election is we've got to deal with the press. And it's got to be beyond, letting Donald Trump go up there and, take haymakers at them rhetorically constantly. There's got to be some sort of grassroots revolt against what the press is doing. They've been regularly wrong on major stories. And like there was a CNN story related to Russia where they claimed that Donald Trump Jr. had gotten the WikiLeaks emails in advance, which suggested that Donald Trump Jr. was colluding with the Russians. And it turned out they had the date on the email wrong, and Donald Trump Jr. got them the same time everyone else did publicly. And CNN didn't retract the story. They literally like rewrote the story to be, President's son gets an email. And they do this thing constantly where like they refuse to admit fault. And those of us that are paying attention, which unfortunately has got to be more and more people in this climate, I don't want to live in a country where everyone has to be a news junkie to know the truth, but that's kind of where we're at. So we've got to do something to reset the narrative with the press, and that's got to be some sort of grassroots pressure. I don't know whether it's on advertisers or how you go about it, but if we want a clear narrative out of this, yes, it will help to have the Durham investigation lay some clear facts out there. But if we want this to, not open our grandkids' history books and be, shocked and appalled, we're going to have to do something to force the media to reckon with this in a real and meaningful way, and that means reckoning with the corruption in their own institutions.
I will say that is why it has to be more than just Kleinsmith. I do think one of Mueller's prosecutors pleading guilty is a huge deal, but it has to be more than that. Otherwise, basically, they will have gotten away with the entire thing, and that is terrifying.
Yeah, and the media, like you said, refuses to grapple with this. The New York Times, for example, their editor, Dean Paquette, admitted essentially in a letter to his staff that they were wrong about Russiagate. He didn't say it so clearly. He covered it up a little bit, but that was essentially what he admitted to his staff, but then said that he was still proud of their coverage and that now they were going to pivot to race relations. So, this is us acknowledging that we did wrong, but now we're just going to go ahead and move on and find the other, daily hoax that we're going to cover. And, even more pernicious, I think, than all of the wrong stories is the way that they were actually used by the intelligence agencies to justify all of the things that they were doing in terms of spying on the Trump campaign. And Mollie, I was hoping you could run through some of the ways that circular sourcing was used, the way that leaks were used in order to further the Crossfire Hurricane probe.
This is why I refer to the media as co-conspirators in the Russia collusion hoax. Nothing would have been accomplished without them engaging in this conspiracy with the intelligence officials. I sometimes wonder if the media people, there are two alternatives, and I always try to put the best construction on other people's actions. Either they were really that stupid that they believed that when these leaks were coming, that they should take them at face value and not apply any skepticism or criticism at all, or they knew exactly that they were being played and they went along with it. Neither of those are particularly good situations for a media that expects to be trusted or whatnot. I try to do this at the Federalist constantly, like go back, because I have been reading all these stories for so long, go back and look at what people wrote. Yes, Dean Beckett admitted that the Russia collusion hoax was a bust, but he did it very obliquely, and they didn't turn back any of the Pulitzers they won for participating in the hoax. Neither did anyone at the Washington Post. They continue to give awards to each other. They continue to justify what they did. That is unacceptable. And I just want to say one great, easy idea for this. I think a lot of Americans actually do understand that the media are not to be trusted. Not a lot of Republican elected officials seem to get that. So recently, Tom Cotton kind of broke the New York Times by having that op-ed about how there may come a time when federal force is needed to restore order, and the New York Times had to like restructure their newsroom because the people within their publication were so upset by this and claimed that it threatened their safety to talk about restoring order to cities. That was back in June. But a lot of people act like the New York Times or Washington Post have something of value that they don't actually have. A lot of Republican elected officials seem to be trying to appease or play nice with media officials who want them dead. I mean, want them and the people who vote for them dead. I don't understand what it's going to take for Republicans to stand up against this. It's not 1980s when, or like early 90s, I remember George H.W. Bush had that bumper sticker that was the favorite slogan of his campaign, which is, annoy the media, re-elect Bush. And that was a fine thing to say in 1992, and I think it resonated with a lot of people. It's 2020. They've gotten so much worse, and they're actually engaged in these conspiracies against the president and the government of this country, and people are still acting like, gosh, gee willikers, the media sure are biased. It's so beyond that, and people in a position of power need to stop allowing themselves to be treated like second-class citizens, which is what the current treatment of conservatives in America is by the media. So yes, there were a number of times, like if you read the Inspector General report about how the FISA process was abused to spy on the Trump campaign, one of the ways is that they filled their application to spy with information that had been leaked to the media to sort of make it sound like they had a better case. Every single thing was coming from the same source, and the same source was the Hillary Clinton campaign. The Hillary Clinton campaign secretly bought and paid for a dossier, and it was not just a dossier, it was actually multiple dossiers. We talk about the dossier being the Steele dossier, but there were others, to infiltrate that into the government, to have the government weaponize that, to leak it to the media. That was all part of the actual thing that they bought and paid for, and to undermine the entire government. It all goes back to the same location, and so it would come from different sources, but it was all the Hillary Clinton campaign. We didn't even know it was the Hillary Clinton campaign for like a year into it, and only way we knew that is because Devin Nunes, who chaired the House Intelligence Committee and took an unbelievable amount of incoming feces for this, worked really hard to find out just who paid for this, and finding out that Hillary Clinton worked with actual foreign agents of Russia to put this out there. If you care about Russian meddling, it took a lot of work for him, and he received nothing but condemnation from the media, and unfortunately from some other Republicans as well, and he was completely right, completely vindicated. That was a real long and circuitous.
No, it was a good answer. And your point about Republicans playing the game with the media is something that, as a reporter, has always bothered me, because we have all these great independent conservative media outlets, but yet still, when the White House or a member of Congress wants to leak a good story, guess who they go to? They go to the Washington Post, they go to the New York Times, they go to these legacy media outlets that are immediately going to spin the story and make them look terrible anyway, so it really makes no sense at all.
I will say there's a lot of work to be done, but I do think this is a big success of the Trump administration. I was working at National Review during the W. Bush administration, and I wrote for a bunch of conservative publications during that time, and it was incredibly frustrating as someone who was like actually, on the beat there, that whenever there was a big story, the George W. Bush administration would go to the New York Times, and it did this again and again and again. Trump administration is actually, there's still some, collaboration with the enemy in ways that I find unhelpful, but they are, because the media has been so hostile, they actually have been they have broken out of that, and they have handed out stories to lots of different conservative publications. Federalist has broken, obviously, lots of major news on Russiagate, and that has been a huge improvement. And I think congressional Republicans are starting to wake up to the fact that the influence of the Washington Post and the New York Times is diminishing, and not just diminishing, it's diminishing incredibly rapidly. I don't think, a big part of the Russiagate stories, I don't think the media have realized what they've done to themselves. And so we're going to see more of that in the future, and that will be good, I think.
And I have a great question here from the audience for Victor, who's our resident historian. With the plea of Kleinsmith, helping the spying on the Trump campaign, how does this compare to Nixon spying on his opponent?
Well, there was never any proof that in the Nixon matter that the major institutions caved in, and that is the CIA and the FBI resisted, the IRS especially. But what's unique about this is that there wasn't so much that the FBI, the CIA, the DOJ, and earlier the IRS had reluctantly agreed to aid the Obama administration. These were active participants, and they were coming up with a lot of the origins, and they're the font of the problem. And I'm talking about Comey and Brennan and Clapper and probably McCabe and Hoover, all of these people. So this was it was really a slow motion coup. And that's different. We've never seen that before. There's a couple of things in your earlier question when you said, well, if Biden were to be elected, would it shut down? I think the answer is obviously yes. But remember, Joe Biden was present in that January 5th meeting in the Oval Office, in which Peter Strzok took notes and said that the call between the Russian ambassador and Flynn was legitimate. And he knew that. Sally Yates, of course, said she didn't remember quite whether Biden had said anything. But then he cooked up this Logan Act excuse as a way of legitimizing the illegal surveillance of Michael Flynn. So if I were Durham, I would go back to that meeting. You can't indict Joe Biden during an election, but I would say he's a non-indicted co-conspirator if there's evidence, or at least mention him, at least prep the battlefield so that if Biden decides to dismiss it, he would have a clear conflict of interest. And it seems that's clear. Final thing about the Mueller team, what was strange about that is that everybody who made legitimate criticisms of that investigation at a time when the media was calling it the Dream Team, the All-Stars, I think Max Boot called it the Hunter-Killer Team, and it was all based on this revolving door resumes and Ivy League pedigrees. And when some of us were writing, wait a minute, this lawyer worked for the Clinton Foundation, this lawyer worked for a Clinton employee. But what the end of it was how corrupt it was. And we only really learned that afterwards. Peter Strzok and Lisa Page were not only removed from that investigatory team, but Mueller himself staggered their departures because he didn't want to look like he was cleaning house. So it was about 60 days, he said, and he never told us why they left. That was up to the IG to tell us that. And Kleinsmith himself had been involved in that investigation. Then when we saw Andrew Weissman go on to cable TV and sort of basically tell us what he was doing the whole time. And then when Mueller over 200 times under those congressional investigations and testimonies said he didn't remember, but he didn't even know what the Steele dossier was. And so to be told that the centerpiece and the reason why that investigation ever existed was the information in the Steele dossier. And then the head investigator to admit under oath he didn't remember, didn't know what it was. That was really incredible. So we've seen things, what I'm getting at, of top government officials that were actively either trying to obstruct the truth or were deeply engaged in things that were illegal. From the FISA courts to Susan Rice's 240 requests for unmasking, which was not a crime in itself, but the leaking to the press was of those names. And then to say under oath, I don't know, I didn't do it. And then we had, more importantly, Samantha Power say, I think hers was 350. She said not only did she not sign those, she didn't know who did. So remember that statement. Here's the ambassador to the UN who has no business surveilling American citizens. And then when there were requests to look at these top secret text and to release the name that was blotted out. And it was under her request that was done. She says, I don't know who did it. And when people ask her, well, if you didn't do it, how did your name? I don't know. So there were a lot of things that we haven't seen any time before, I think, in the Nixon scandals or anything. We have to go back to the 19th century to find something comparable.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think it was James Comey who was on CNN, and he said that it was Republicans who actually were responsible for starting the Steele dossier, which was a lie that was started by the media, and then because of the Free Beacon's involvement or Paul Singer's involvement, and in a opposition research on Trump using fusion GPS, not anything to do with the Steele dossier, but the fact that the FBI director believed that because he had read it in the Washington Post was stunning.
This might be a little too in the weeds, but I want to follow up on that. Yeah. The Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee said that when the government tried to spy on Carter Page, they didn't say enough about where the Steele dossier came from. And the media and their colleagues in the Democratic Party said, no, it said in there that we thought that it was politically motivated. Now, that's true. There was a footnote that said there might be political motivation here. The director of the FBI himself was confused about whether it came from Republicans or Hillary Clinton. It came from Hillary Clinton. So in other words, the Republicans were absolutely correct, and yet when they came out with their memo saying that there was wrongdoing in the FISA process, they were just by everybody renounced, and yet they were 100% right, and Comey proved it. But all of these little things, if they were going the other way, the media would blow into bombshells, but like with the Klein-Smith plea or with the Inspector General report, they just try to bury it as quickly as possible.
So along that, I just want to say something that adds on both of what Mollie just said and what Victor just said, which is that the scariest aspect of abuse of power is what you don't know. And when you think about what happened with all of this, imagine if Trump had not won that crazy election, what they would have gotten away with, and how terrifying that is. And like that needs to be repeated at every turn. And then on top of that, as Mollie just pointed out, at every turn when we've had these, amazing levels of malfeasance exposed, the media has sought to downplay them. And the media's job here is to tell us what's going on so that, we don't live in fear that our government is in the shadows, spying on us and abusing all of our rights. And yet we're in this terrible place right now where we cannot trust, high-level law enforcement agencies not to spy on us and grossly violate our rights. And when we do, and when that is exposed, the idea that the media is going to look at us and go, well, who did they vote for? Are they Christian? Are going to ask all these loaded questions and then justify what they did.
I would just add very
And let's go
quickly-
ahead and bring it back to present day, because as I mentioned when we started the panel, we're 2 months away from the election, and we've already had quite a few conspiracy theories brewing. For example, the idea that Trump is out there, stealing mailboxes and throwing them in the trash, or that he's like running around like the Grinch who stole Christmas, taking, ballots out of mailboxes. And I guess my question is, like, why? Why are they doing this again? Because they've been exposed so much.
I actually think it's projection. That's one of the things I realized when Hillary Clinton was the one working with Russians to undermine the 2016 election, but accused her opponent of that. It was pure projection. All of these things about not accepting election results are actually what they're doing, and thinking about ways to steal the election, I think, are things that they're thinking about doing, and they actually have a lot of means of doing it. Anyone from California can attest to this. And so I think Republicans are thinking, as they're being accused, they'll say, oh, Donald Trump won't leave office if he's not reelected. And they get very defensive about that. They shouldn't be defensive. They should realize their opponents are laying out their own game plan of what they plan to do in terms of resisting elections, free and fair elections. And they should start waking up to it and being much more aggressive in fighting it.
I think
would
part of the
just add-
problem here is this feedback loop between Democratic politicians and the media. They have no reality check. So they just feed off of each other's own worst impulses. Joe Biden at a campaign rally a couple of weeks ago said something about, you see what they're doing in Oregon, taking down all the mailboxes? I mean, they've removed something like 40 mailboxes in Portland and Seattle in the last 6 months or something. The volume of first-class mail in this country has dropped from like 100 billion pieces of mail a year to about just over 50 in 20 years. We need fewer mailboxes, people. How many millennials that are writing handwritten letters to their parents? It doesn't happen. And Oregon is a state that Hillary Clinton won by 11 points. I mean, Donald Trump is not stealing the election in Oregon by taking down 40 mailboxes, and yet somehow this gets treated as an entirely credible thing. You know, if Donald Trump had uttered something crazy, there'd be, the 4-alarm fire at PolitiFact, and yet this stuff just goes completely unnoticed. So they just get to indulge this stuff, and it makes them all paranoid and delusional.
I would just add, could I add some, why are they engaging in these conspiracy theories? We had Hillary Clinton, remember, saying Biden shouldn't concede under any circumstances, assuming that, I guess she's assuming he might lose. And Nancy Pelosi recently said there should be no debates. And Don Lemon said, you've got to start talking about the violence. And Joe Biden said the violence was caused by Donald Trump. And Michelle and everybody at the DNC just kept saying, vote, 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 vote. That was the message of the DNC. And you get the impression that although Reuters or Political has Trump down by 14, they don't believe it. And by that, I mean, there's really only two ways that you can ascertain public opinion. And that's by people who are disinterested. One are Las Vegas bettors. They don't care who wins, they want to make money. And when you look at the betting odds, they've gone down insidiously but steadily, so they're almost 50-50 now, and the majority of odds of people who make daily bets is about 85% for Trump. And they're hedging their bets. That is, they're betting money now to make up for their earlier bets when Biden was a sure winner, say 2 months ago. And then the other are internal polls. And so what's making people worried on the Democratic side and lashing out, get rid of the debates or never concede or get anybody to vote is that they have internal polls that are telling them that things are not going well. And I think they don't know, and more importantly, finally, I don't think they have yet a way to stop it because it's a trajectory that they're looking at the last 15 days. It's very small, it's very insidious, but it's steady. And they're looking at what should we do? And Biden is a prisoner of his own paradoxes. If he goes out, he's going to blow the election. I think I used that metaphor, like Admiral Jellicoe in World War I, the only man Churchill said he could lose a war in an afternoon. Biden is capable of losing the election in 10 seconds. And they don't want that to happen. Yet if he doesn't go out, it shows that he's enfeebled. He wants to avoid the debate, but yet he's going to be an empty chair with Clint Eastwood, like Trump playing the role of Clint Eastwood talking to him. So they've got a lot of paradoxes, but I think the internal polls explain a lot of the sudden resort to these conspiracy theories, which they always embrace, but now there's a frenzy about them we haven't seen before.
You're right, they're nervous. Well, that's all the time we have, unfortunately, but Mollie, Mark, Victor, thank you all so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Indeed, how great was that?